especially during the winter period where it's not so easy to observe them directly. So what the team did is that they equipped Antarctic petrels with GLSs, geolocators, and they also performed stable isotopic analysis on their feathers. They worked at the Svarthammer colony close to the Troll station in the Norwegian part of Antarctica. It's a large nunatak inland, and it's facing the South Atlantic sector of Antarctica. So they did that study in 2010, 2011, 2012, I believe, and did you mute me, Grant?
Sorry,
no, okay.
It looks like you got muted there somehow or another.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah. Okay. So what the geolocator analysis showed is that the birds spend the winter months off the Weddell Sea, so facing the South Atlantic, and the striking thing is that they spent 60 to 80% of their time out of the water, although they were out to sea. And coupling this with remote sensing data suggested that they rest on icebergs during that period. They like relatively small icebergs, it seems, close to the marginal ice zone where they feed on krill, myctophid fish, and squid. And I can really imagine these birds resting on the icebergs and then feeding around them, because of course, around icebergs, there's enhanced marine productivity. And what the authors say is that, of course, sea ice patterns are changing in Antarctica, and they say that working on these Antarctic petrels would be a good way to monitor what's going on with the ice. So I found this really cool. But my first question to Arnaud would be to develop maybe a little more about other seabirds using icebergs. For instance, in the Arctic, there are direct observations of kittiwakes doing that. Black guillemots, there are even pictures of great cormorants resting on icebergs in West Greenland, and also direct observations of ivory gulls of Northeast Greenland using a gravel-covered iceberg as a breeding site. So I wanted to ask Arnaud maybe to elaborate on how common this feature might be.
Hey Arnaud, you're unmuted, so you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. It's the first time for me. I think it's a really very good initiative, so thanks for that. Regarding your question, David, I'm actually not very familiar with all the studies in the Arctic, so you probably know more than me about it, but I suspect it's actually a very common feature in seabirds. First, because of course it has been documented, but also it makes a lot of sense biologically speaking. It's a perfect place to rest, especially in open ocean areas, and also it's just usually very productive areas around the icebergs, usually because of the meltwater, which is fresh water, which creates gradients in right around the temperature gradients and salinity gradients right around the ice features, and all this create very good productivity conditions in the ocean. So okay, I suspect it's just two good reasons to gather on these icebergs. Sorry.
And yeah, I forgot to mention that actually you could have an idea of the time budget and the activity of the birds, because the geolocators you use, they had these wet and dry sensor.
Right.
And in the North Atlantic, there has been quite a lot of discussions about seabirds equipped with GLSs and dry and white sensors, and actually keeping a foot in the plumage so that you get false dry status. Is it something you considered with the Antarctic petrels?
No, we didn't consider that, and I know it's a problem with some of the seabirds, like those we are studying in SeaTrack that you're well aware of, and particularly the Alcids. But no, I don't think it's a problem in Antarctic petrels. Their morphology is also very different, but very honestly, I don't know. It could be. I've never observed myself an Antarctic petrel at sea. So it's not completely impossible, but I don't think it happens. I don't see them doing that.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder whether from direct observations, because the first evidence that Antarctic petrels were going onto icebergs, that comes from at-sea cruises and people actually seeing them on the icebergs, and also maybe at the sea surface. That might be a way to check how they keep their feet in the process.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, and the last question before we open to the audience and to Grant, the last question from my side would be that this study, actually the data were collected nearly 10 years ago, and I wondered whether in that sector the sea ice dynamics in terms of the marginal ice zone and the iceberg dynamics, do you think that it changed a lot in these 10 years?
Not that much. The sea ice around the Antarctic has been pretty stable in the last decades compared to what's happening in the Arctic, and it's starting to change slowly. But for the moment, it's still very, especially in winter, it's still very stable, and we still reach the median extent over the last 3 decades every year, and sometimes go even beyond. So it's not that this kind of dramatic reduction in sea ice extent like we can see in the Arctic. So I would say that it's remained more or less the same, but it's starting to change slowly. I think every year I'm looking at the maps, and it seems that especially the breakup in early spring, November, or early summer, November, December is happening at a different pace and maybe more rapidly. But for the winter, it's pretty stable.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. Grant, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple. Thanks, Arnaud. This is some interesting stuff. I've yet to see Antarctic petrel in the wild myself, actually, despite the fact that I go down there every year. I keep my fingers crossed, though, that every time I'm down, I'll pass an iceberg with Antarctic petrels on them. We often have reports of several hundred sort of in October, November time on the ships that you might see on drifting icebergs, which is pretty cool. So my first question is mostly around the spatial scale that you guys are presenting here. So the GLS tags that you guys used obviously have a fair amount of error with it. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how confident you are in the association with icebergs when GLS tags are known to have a relatively large error with them.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very fair question. So first of all, originally in that study, we wanted to focus on sea ice and not necessarily on icebergs. And that's something Karine, and I think maybe Akiko as well, came up with later on, and we all found that it was a very good idea, exciting idea, and but maybe not possible to tackle with the data we had at hand. And I think it actually worked out quite well despite this very low spatial resolution that we have with the GLS. And I think it shows that there is something happening in spite of this, and so we can be confident in the data, and we can't go further because of this lack of resolution. But what the GLS would do in that case is add noise in our data. I don't think they would bias the data, at least not towards icebergs, for example. I don't see why GLS data would be attracted to iceberg features, which are, distributed in not really long latitudinal gradient, at least in the seasonal ice zone. Mm-hmm. So no, I'm actually pretty confident in those results. And I was actually surprised that it worked so well. I think it's pretty nice. But of course, I mean, we can't we can't go into the details. We can't know how close they were to these icebergs and how often and all those kind of things. But it's just like a very strong signal that there is something happening here and that it deserves more focus and more studies.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So do you think that maybe the types, do you think there's differences in how they're using different types of ice? So for example, are they using the sea ice edge for foraging? Are they using icebergs for loafing and resting? Do you think there may even be differences in sort of the size of how they use different types of icebergs? So you have these really supermassive tabular bergs, for example, which may have different oceanographic properties around it compared to, say, small icebergs, which they may just be loafing on.
Yeah, I mean, they could definitely have different way to use the different types of iceberg and sea ice. And maybe we also don't need to relate everything to foraging only. There could be a social aspect into this. I mean, gathering in huge groups and acquiring information, for example, but other foraging places or anything else, I mean, could be also a reason why it would be interesting for a petrel to just stop by on a huge iceberg where there are many other petrels already sitting. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible and something we can't really address for the moment, of course, in that study.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys think you guys will be following up on this, perhaps using more fine-scale GPS tags in the future, or is there scope for that? Or actually, and that being said, how easy is it to deploy on these birds, because they're obviously relatively small?
Yeah, well, it's about 500-600 grams, so it's big enough for GLSs, and for GPS that would last so long, of course, as a year, because it's during the winter. So that's another problem. Mm-hmm. So for the moment, we don't have the technology. I think we would need maybe Argos transmitters and something very lightweight, but I think it would still be very difficult.
Yeah.
So we are not there yet, but hopefully soon. I've heard there are people working on solutions.
Yeah.
Small solutions.
Thanks a lot, Arnaud. All right, folks, we'll open it up to the audience. Does anyone here have any questions? Please use the raise your hand option, or if you've got your camera on and you just feel like flailing your arms around, that's okay too.
And maybe Jan and Akiko want to add something as well. I know Jan was very eager to talk about this paper. So.
Jan, if you're, I can unmute Jan. Where is he? Oh, here he is. There you go. Hi, Jan. Hi, Jan. I've just unmuted you. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's called a revenge from Arnaud, because I kept on pestering him when he was speaking on the chat. But no, I mean, he answered very well to most of the questions, so we don't have much else to say except that Akiko was mentioning for the. It's called a revenge for my wife. Come back. No, she was mentioning for the icebergs because we cannot say very fine scale what the birds were doing with the icebergs. We chose to use spatial grids of 2 degrees to model actually what's. Yeah, she's coming back. She's feeling better now about what I'm saying. We chose a spatial grid that allow us to say there is an association, but without going into the detail of what association it was really. Mm-hmm. And as for the technology to cover a year of fine-scale resolution, I'm less optimistic than Arnaud for that. I think we still have a few years ahead of us of testing and waiting for the good solution, but who knows? Maybe it's coming faster than I thought. Maybe I'm an old fart already.
No, you're not that old yet.
Well,
you're old when you're dead.
Yeah, judged by the length of your beard, Jan, you clearly have to do something.
It's called confinement. You're not supposed to see me.
Yeah, right. Right. Any questions from the crowd? There must be at least one out there. Oh yeah, we got one from Ellie Honan. I'm going to unmute you. All right, Ellie, you're unmuted. Go for it.
Hi, thank you. I don't have a background in this, but I was just wondering why you went for the Antarctic petrels over the snow petrels.
Oh, Oh, Jan. Oh, hang on a second. Let me unmute Arnaud and Jan. There you go, Arnaud. Go for it.
Yes, sorry. Can you repeat the question? I was trying to unmute myself and then lost focus. A minute.
If I rephrase it, do you think you'd see similar amongst the snow petrels as you would the Antarctic petrels?
It's a very good question. I think in winter, yes, maybe not as much in summer. I think snow petrels would be more in the ice during the summer, in denser sea ice. And during the winter, there is the marginal ice zone is getting much smaller, much narrower, basically. So there's a lot more of very dense sea ice and then a little bit of less dense sea ice, where both species might have to be because they don't have many other places to go. So I would expect there is a difference between the species in summer and not as much in winter.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Ellie. And we've got a question from Richard Bevan.
Hi there.
Go for it, Richard.
Hi there. I posted it on the chat, but I was just wondering, how do Antarctic petrels feed? I just wondered, sort of, are they surface feeders, or are they do they dive as well? I'm thinking more in line with the comment that was put before mine, which is about putting loggers on. And I think as soon as we start getting bigger loggers, how do we put them on for long periods of time?
There are surface feeders mostly, but they can dive a little bit, but not very, very deep. So just maybe 1 or 2 meters from what I've heard, because as I said, I haven't had the luck yet, the opportunity to observe them at sea. But yeah, so regarding the loggers, it could work definitely. They're not diving very deep.
Okay, but these are quite big birds, so they could actually you could get one of these small pathfinder ones onto a leg ring on these birds, I guess.
Well, that would be the idea is with these path track devices, that they would have more or less the size of a large GLS, but not more.
Yeah.
But how long do they last?
They last 1 year with 1 location per day. I mean, that's the plan. They don't last anything for the moment because they don't exist yet. They are still a prototype.
Yeah, so that solves the idea of the long term. Like, we can record for 1 year, but the fine scale is still an issue. I mean, we can't get fine scale with 1 location per day.
No, I mean, you get like the equivalent in terms of temporal resolution. You get the equivalent of a GLS logger, or a bit less, because you have only 1 position per day instead of 2. But you have the precision of a GPS, so 10, 15 meters, hopefully. So it's still much better. But I mean, you solve a huge part of the problem.
Sure. No, I was thinking more about, like, how often they are on the iceberg, what they do, or this kind of association.
Yeah, right. That's true. Yeah, but
you can talk about that later. I mean,
yeah, that's a good point.
Cool. All right, a couple more questions. First one is from Mariana. Where are we? Unmute you. There you go, Mariana. You're unmuted.
Hi.
Hi.
So I have a question that is always related to this fine scale, let's say, activity. I was wondering how I have never worked with GLS, so I was wondering if what you could see from this activity budget, even if they are like crude and very coarse scale, what you could see, and if you could see a variation between individuals, and if you in the future, not now, whatever, you could actually relate whatever happens during winter to the reproductive success of the year after.
Yes, very good question. So the resolution of this wet-dry sensor is actually much higher than the temporal resolution. It's like every 10 minutes we have a value, basically, and it could be even higher than that. It's just a question of memory in the loggers. If we have a higher frequency of recording, then we just clog the memory at one point, and then we don't get any data anymore. So it's a trade-off. But they are very precise compared to the interval of positioning that we have. So you can definitely look into inter-individual differences in activity patterns, and it's been done, I think, several times. I haven't played with those data myself, so Akiko probably has, and Karine as well, so they might have a better answer here.
Okay, thanks, Mariana. I'm just going to mute you there. Lucas, I believe Lucas Skurger had a question, and then Stefan Oppel after him. Lucas, you should be on. There you go. You're unmuted now, Lucas.
Okay. Hello. Grant, David, Arnaud, and authors. Thank you very much. Is everyone listening?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Thank you. More than a question, I'd like to come back to the question of the false dry state from the geolocators. While I tend to agree with Arnaud that probably with procellary forms it's not a big problem, but it could be tested. I'd like to propose a brainstorming because I was thinking maybe it's possible to test that using even for short-term periods with geolocator data with some miniaturized cameras on the birds. I'm not sure if there are some model of cameras feed to birds that weight 500 grams, but maybe it should be possible for a short period of time. Any ideas on that? Maybe it's interesting to share some ideas on this.
I think, I mean, is it a question to everyone, or I guess so?
Yeah. Like general, yeah. Because maybe it's possible to test in the future.
I think it's it's definitely super interesting. The problem for the moment is more like how to outfit a camera on a bird for that long period. So it could work in the summer, but then the conditions are very different, and we don't know if they use the icebergs as much in summer. They probably do a little bit when they find some, but I mean they are really constrained in terms of time during the reproductive period, while in winter they're staying there all the time. So to do that in winter, you will need a camera that can stay on the bird for 1 year basically.
I probably don't have that technology yet.
In both the technology and I mean you would need something which is not bigger than a GLS.
And do you think the data from summer could not be used to estimate some probabilities of false dry state in the winter?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
There was a comment on here. Virginia posted in the chat saying that there are little Leonardo cameras that are pretty small, but I think they're relatively expensive. You'd have to retrieve them as well. Oh, Jan wants to say something really briefly as well. I'll let him on. Jan, if you can be relatively brief, and then I will get onto the last question for this section.
I wanted to tell to Virginia that actually the little Leonardo camera is not an option because no, Virginia, the little Leo camera, it's actually something we used on penguins, but the maximum recording time is 4 hours for the moment. 7 hours. So that works if you can program the camera to start at a given time where you think it's interesting to monitor, but not yet for what Lucas, I think, has in mind. And indeed, it's very expensive. Was I brief enough?
Yeah, that was fine, like Jan. All right, I will. I'll mute you, and then we're going to go to Stefan Oppel. Stefan, you're unmuted.
Hi, I just had a quick question whether you looked at the possible energetic benefit of sitting on the ice. There's a lot of research from Jim Lovorn about sea ducks wintering in the Bering Sea, and I think he found that the spectacle eiders can only survive in a hole in the ice because it's energetically so much more efficient for them to roost on the ice than in the cold water, because water has a much higher thermal conductivity, so they would lose a lot more energy if they were sitting in the water. Obviously, eiders sit around most of the day and petrels don't, so the margin of the benefit might be much, much smaller for a petrel. It spends most of the time in the air anyway, but that might be an interesting question to model and see what would be the energetic expenditure when they were sitting in the water, which is probably very cold, versus sitting on the iceberg, where they sit in air and have less loss of thermal energy?
That's a great question. We didn't look into that, definitely not. But I think it's something we should maybe do. I'm not sure how we could do that. Yeah, but it's no, it makes perfect sense. And they are actually spending quite a lot of time sitting on the ice or flying. But we found that 60 to 80% of the time they were either flying or sitting. So yeah, they are not most of the time sitting on the water, that's for sure. So that could be a very good reason.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. All right, Dimas, you had one question. If you can be relatively brief, that would be fantastic, and then we'll move on. Oh, let me try unmuting you, see if that works.
Yeah.
There we go. Hi, Dimas.
Hello, guys. How are you doing?
Good.
It's very nice to be
Hello.
In touch with all of you and brainstorms and discussing these papers. Well, I've tried to be very briefly. My question is more about curiosity on the ecological process that sea ice benefit the petrels. Well, we all know how sea ice extend influence krill biomass by providing shelter and reproduction and substrate for the algae they feed on, increasing well, food for the whole ecological cascade. But I was quite curious about when the effect of individual icebergs in the open sea. I imagine that these icebergs are still providing shelter and feeding opportunities for krill. So I imagine icebergs floating with krill together with them. So I'm wondering in which extent these attract other prey for the petrels in the open areas. And in this sense, well, in the open sea, floating objects attract large amounts of fish, and they are often used as fishing aggregating device. So I'm wondering if there is knowledge on that, or in which extent icebergs floating on the open sea could have a similar effect when attracting fish and biomass. That was my question.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any work on this, but there is probably, and yeah, David has something to say, so I'll let him the word.
Well, if I get your question right, there's actually a 1974 Nature paper about enhanced productivity around icebergs in Antarctica, which I think gives a really good baseline for the assumption that you know there's a lot to feed on around icebergs. If that answers your question.
Yeah, I think Jan may have had a quick comment there too. There we go.
Very quick, just to emphasize that there are lots of forthcoming and just published work also showing that many different types of predators are apparently attracted by to icebergs, and so that suggests that there is a food chain quite diverse and rich around these. That was just a little comment.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. I think if you have any more questions, please feel free to put them down in the group chat. And if the authors, Arnaud, Jan, if you guys can respond to any questions down there, that would be great. David, I think we can go on to the next paper.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grant. And now we'll be talking about a bycatch assessment in US fisheries. And we're very fortunate to have Matt Savoca with us from NOAA Fisheries to talk about the paper. And the paper is a collaboration between his lab and the Institute of Marine Science in Monterey, UCSC Institute of Marine Science. And the backdrop is, of course, fisheries bycatch as a global issue with 10 million tons caught and of marine organisms caught and wasted each year, and a very varied levels of bycatch depending on the fisheries, on the countries, and also some very counterintuitive results with level of bycatch, which sometimes have no link with development level of the different countries. If, for instance, you think about the Mediterranean section of French waters, in France, we have more or less no assessment still today of bycatch levels in the French Mediterranean. But fortunately, in the US, there's something which is called the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is really important because it requires all fisheries to have a management plan and report on bycatch. And also there's the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And these three bodies really give a strong framework for regulating and minimizing bycatch by managing fisheries. So what the authors did, they used these reports for 95 fisheries in the US, in US waters across 2010 to 2015. And on this basis, they developed a relative bycatch index that accounts not only for bycatch numbers and discard rate, but also the conservation status of the target stocks and bycatch species. And what they found is that the overall discard rate of all fishery years was 10.5%, and that was about half what they expected to find on the basis of previous estimates. And this suggests that US fisheries are responsible for only 3.5% of discards worldwide. So this is a general discard assessment, or not only about seabirds, and it showed that most discarded stuff is actually fish. And it also showed that in terms of volume, longline fisheries in the tropical Pacific, no, sorry, not in terms of bycatch volume, but in terms of bycatch index, which takes into account the volume, but also the conservation status of a species. So this longline fishery in the tropical Pacific had the highest bycatch index. And this was mainly due to bycatch of seabirds and turtles. But specifically for the seabirds, the highest bycatch was recorded for Alaska, and in particular the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. And even more specifically, the Pacific cod longline fleet was responsible for about 24,000 bycatch seabirds during the study period. And that was more than all other fisheries in the data set. And yet a lot less than what occurred in the past. Yet what the authors stress is that there's probably a bias in this assessment, because there's a really strong focus on Alaska and on recording bycatch in Alaska because of the emblematic vulnerable short-tail albatross. And because of this, it seems that seabird bycatch levels in other fisheries were underestimated simply because the effort for recording such bycatch was lower. So the big question at the end of reading this paper is how representative are bycatch estimates for seabirds for the whole of US waters. And this is where I would like Matt maybe to elaborate a little more, talking about the situation in Alaska compared to other regions of US waters.
You're good to go, Matt. You're unmuted.
All right. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. Thanks, Grant, Navid, for having me. Yeah, so I guess to answer your first question, was it particularly how does Alaskan fisheries compare to other fisheries, other regions' fisheries in the US, or how do Alaskan fisheries compare to global fisheries? What was the specifics of your question?
It's actually, so as a first stage, Alaska waters compared to other US waters. And please refine if I didn't present things correctly.
Right, so one of the things that will be a common refrain when we're talking about bycatch, whether it's in the US or internationally, is data limitations are a huge issue. And so in the US, the US has some of the better in terms of bycatch recording, as you mentioned. We do a good job because of federal mandates which our government is currently trying to dismantle all of, that requires the recording and dissemination of bycatch data. So hopefully that sticks around, because I and presumably everyone on this call thinks that's important information to collect. But the collection and dissemination of that information is driven by legal statutes and mandates. And so the point of this is to say that the only fisheries that are required to record and disseminate bycatch are those fisheries that could interact with ESA listed species, which is Endangered Species Act. And the only ESA listed species that we have that is caught in our waters is a short-tailed albatross, or potentially caught. It's thankfully very, very rarely caught. But in any case, those fisheries are required by law to record seabird bycatch. What I'm getting to is, your question is a great one, but unfortunately, we're limited by the data that the fisheries collect and disseminate. So what we do know is, because of the regions that do collect seabird bycatch, and disseminate seabird bycatch information, which is the Pacific Island region, the Alaska region, and I think also the West Coast region as well. Of those regions, Alaskan fisheries bycatch the most seabirds in terms of total number. But also, it's tough to think about it in terms of just straight numbers, because Alaskan fisheries also produce by far the most resources in terms of fish caught and sold and consumed. For example, the Alaskan pollock fleet, Bering Sea pollock is one of the world's largest fisheries. I think it's second or third in terms of total biomass caught and sold worldwide. So it's, you have tremendous, tremendous fisheries in terms of the scale of this operation. And as everyone on this call knows, the Bering Sea is a critically important area for lots and lots of seabirds, dense concentrations of fulmars and albatross and other types of petrels, and even more nearshore seabirds concentrated in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. So perhaps it's not surprising that the Alaska region, of the regions that actually record seabird bycatch in the US, has the most in terms of total number. But again, also the Alaska region produces by far the most fish resources of any region in the US. But yeah, to answer your question in a long-winded format, basically, even the US that does a good job collecting and disseminating this data could do even better in terms of collecting more complete data, as opposed to data that's collected solely based on the potential for its interaction with an endangered species, which is the short-tailed albatross in this case.
Okay, so to summarize, probably the US overall is doing a fair job, especially compared to other nations. Think of Southern Europe, for instance, about collecting bycatch data. But is it fair to say that it could be better, and that even for US waters, there's not a complete picture about the level of seabird bycatch?
Yeah, that's absolutely, I would say that's absolutely accurate. And even more so for international fisheries. And I don't want to call out everyone's country, because I'm sure there's someone on this call being like, no, our country does a great job. Maybe that's true. Frankly, I don't know. But what I do know is that as a global issue, in terms of non-target species, which is to say all bycatch, globally, there is very poor coverage of bycatch information. That goes for seabirds as well as other taxa as well. And actually, I've accumulated a bunch of references on this in particular in relation to seabirds, which I'm happy to share with the group. Should anyone be interested, I could talk to Grant or whomever. I also realized that the link that Grant posted, I think, doesn't actually allow access to our full paper, which is frustrating, because everyone should have access to this. So I can absolutely send out a link to that as well, where you can find the full study. But and all of our data is public. We have our Shiny app. So if you ever wanted to explore it, you being anyone on the call or elsewhere, you can explore the data for yourself, see what you think. And I think what could be really valuable for people interested in data limitations or data asymmetries between nations or between regions globally, I think there's definitely a lot of space to update and add to these bycatch estimates for for seabirds in global fisheries as well, particularly in certain regions like the Asian region. We have very little data for, and the data that we have, we don't know how much we can trust it. So for those people who are interested maybe in some fancy statistical or machine learning algorithm, there's a lot of room to improve on the international stage in terms of bycatch. But one of the things, and bycatch sort of knowledge in terms of seabirds and turtles in particular. But one thing that our analysis did show is stuff that we kind of already knew. Basically, that long lines are particularly problematic for a lot of seabirds, and that seemed to be the number one gear type that would catch seabirds, and oftentimes those birds would die on the line, which is not always true actually. So when we're talking about bycatch here, the animal doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily fatal. So a lot of turtles, for example, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, but to go beyond seabirds, one of the reasons why I was keen to discuss this paper is that one of the first conclusions is, of course, about the huge volume of fish being taken as bycatch, and I think it's interesting for seabirders to put this always in perspective and to remember that in the first line of bycatch is, of course, fish. Sometimes we tend to forget because we're so focused on seabirds and charismatic species. Of course, lots of fish are charismatic. If you think about sharks, skates, and rays, and they are very high, I think, on the bycatch list also.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of pounds of elasmobrang shark rays bycatch in our fisheries. So enormous amounts, yes, absolutely. And
from a conservation point of view, and for US waters, do you think that this is ecologically even more critical than seabird bycatch?
Oh man, it's hard to say. I mean, if I had to pick a taxa that I think is potentially at greatest risk, it would be certain species of seabirds or sea turtles. Sea turtles are especially certain populations. So it's particular populations of turtles, fish, and birds. It's hard to say, bycatch is more of a problem for a taxa. But it's one of those things where there are gear, like where you have an overlap of a particular gear type in a particular region, it can be very problematic for certain species. So in California, where I'm at, for example, we recently, as a state, shut down the drift gillnet fishery in Californian waters, which the reason for that is because that fishery trapped lots of marine mammals, small things like dolphins primarily, and sea lions, but also they trapped Pacific leatherbacks, which are a critically endangered population segment of leatherback sea turtles, where even a couple caught leatherbacks could be extremely detrimental to the Pacific population of leatherback turtles. So, and as a result, that whole fishery shut down. But one of the things that I learned in terms, and I think this is actually quite an interesting lesson for whether you study seabirds, whether you study conservation on any scale and any taxa, is that we're in a global civilization. Of course, that's an obvious fact. But what I mean by that is some of the people that I worked with at NOAA were for our National Fisheries Agency were actually interested in keeping our drift gillnet fishery open. Whereas Oceana and other organizations used essentially our bycatch data, I don't want to say against us, but used our own bycatch data to say, no, this is why we need to shut the fishery down. And so what you might ask yourself is, why would our federal fisheries agency want to keep open this drift gillnet fishery? Now, one reason could be because our fisheries agency is under our Department of Commerce, and we want to keep people employed. But that's not the only reason. The conservation reason for why we would probably want to keep our drift gillnet fishery open is because if you consider demand for these particular fish species in our country, let's say, or anywhere in the world. So the drift gillnet primarily targeted swordfish in California. And if you eliminate the drift gillnet fishery in California, that could be a good conservation story on a national level. But the question is, does it actually decrease our demand for swordfish? And the answer is almost certainly not. And then as a result, we get our swordfish from international fisheries where there often isn't bycatch information recorded at all. So, you know, it's kind of an interesting, you have to kind of think about these problems in a global way, especially when you're on the management side, which I am not, but at least I have now had a chance to interact with people on the management side. And it's been a very eye-opening perspective because, you know, from a pure conservation point, you'd be like, well, why would you want to not close down a drift gillnet fishery? They catch mammals, they catch birds, they catch turtles, da-da-da. But, you know, it's an interesting point when you think about the globalization of fisheries.
Mm. Well, I guess you have to start somewhere, and also you have to start tracing the products much better than what is done at the moment. So that's right. Probably the way to go. Right. Grant, do you have any comments?
Yeah, first, Matt, I want to say congratulations on getting a nice paper through. It's obviously a fair amount of work you guys have put into this, and nice to get in Nature, of course. And
you missed me, Grant? You missed me?
I was going to say that you really touched me when you brought up machine learning and our shining.
I thought you would like that.
Almost within the same paragraph. You were like you were buttering me up or something.
Hey, well, I'm telling you, there's probably money for people to do this sort of bycatch estimations better, especially in data limited situations. But
yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, there's all sorts of interesting ways you can implement machine learning or even Bayesian techniques to start looking at this. So my just had a quick question about your relative bycatch index, and just in a broad sense, how comparable is this relative index across regions? So is the index for Alaska that you've generated really comparable to, say, the one for the Pacific Islands, and if so, or if not, I should say, how would you go about getting it to a point where you could have comparable indices?
Yeah, so it is designed to be comparable. Every fishery in that database, in our database, is designed to be able to be compared directly to each other. That said, when we designed this, it wasn't meant to be the end-all be-all or the final product. The way I saw it, and still see it, is sort of a first step into thinking how might you integrate multi-taxonomic bycatch. So you have bycatch for turtles, which is and birds, which is almost always collected in terms of numbers of individuals. And then you have bycatch for fish, which is almost always collected in terms of pounds. So, and then some species, as we talked about, some species are endangered and some species are common. And, so how do you sort of bring in all of this disparate data, and how are you able to assess a fishery's bycatch performance? And that's what we tried to do here. And so I don't think it's the end answer, but I hope it's the start of a way to think about a more holistic way to think about, bycatch and sustainability in terms of the bycatch aspect of sustainability for different fisheries. But one point which you bring up, and I will gladly point out a weakness in our own study because, whatever, let's get science to a better place. One of the things we were unable to do because the data just isn't, I think it could be done in the future, but we haven't done it here, is account for the size of the fishery. Because that data is actually kind of hard to get at in terms of like how much, in terms of how do you assess that? Pounds of landings, economic value of landings, number of boats, number of fishermen. So, that was one issue. But the point is we have not included that. And what you'll notice actually is in certain fisheries, like there's a couple Hawaii longlines, and one of the Hawaii longlines has a much redder color. I think it's the deep set longline than the other Hawaii longline. And people have asked us actually, why is that the case? People at NOAA actually, who study bycatch, but were not involved in this paper, have asked us, why is that the case? In all of our bycatch analyses, we had it flipped. Or, qualitatively for them as people who think about those Hawaiian longline fisheries in great detail, they've always said, I always thought that other fishery was worse. And the reason for that is because that other fishery is worse if you look at just the number of bycatch, but in terms of the comparison of those two Hawaiian longline fisheries, the one that has, worse bycatch is also a much larger fishery for a much more valuable fish, which is tuna. So, how do you balance the desire to mitigate and reduce bycatch, but also this economic and in some cases, nutritional imperative to catch the best and the most fish you can, given whatever regulations you have in your country. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of room to do more here, I think. But the point, to answer your question, Grant, is yes, these are meant to be comparable, all these fisheries to each other. But there are ways to improve and build upon this, certainly. And I'd be actually quite interested in talking with people, if anyone here is interested in doing a more deep dive into, well, I guess with this group, it'd probably be birds, but in any taxa, in the future, looking at data, either nationally or globally.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Matt. All right. Anybody in the crowd have some questions for Matt? Feel free to wave frantically at the screen. Oh, we've got one from Jen Provencher. Hello, Jen. Go for it.
Oh, I'm going to try to do this before my +1 comes back, but she's already back. Just a really question, Matt. Great paper, by the way. I think it's super interesting, and we've been working on seabird bycatch in the Arctic for a few years now. So one thing, looking at your data, I'm always jealous of the U.S. data. The U.S. data is amazing. But as you very well said, we don't have much of this data for the rest of the world. And so in some ways there's like the deep dive question that you just covered in terms of like really digging in. But in some ways, I almost wonder if you've thought about like going back a step, like a simplified version of this to actually make a more oh good, now she's jumping, a more comparable global, because this is really great, like you've got this data across the US, but it's hard to actually compare either deeper or more simple for the rest of the world. And I wonder if you've thought about that, like making a more simplified index, which would maybe potentially assist in like international comparisons.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think so. Alistair Hobday from Australia, he's a fisheries bycatch guy, and he developed a while ago, maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, developed some cool productivity susceptibility analyses for different fish stocks. And what that does is that takes basically, as far as I understand it, and someone on this call probably understands it better than I do, but basically it takes a variety of data quality inputs and then produces a very simplified metric for different fish stocks in terms of their productivity, which is their biological life history. Basically, how much of a problem would it be if you caught this species, right, in terms of their growth rate and their age to reproduction and their reproductive rate and all these sorts of things. And then what is their susceptibility? What are their odds of actually being bycaught? So I think what could be cool, and I haven't seen, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, I just haven't seen it, is something simple like that, where you take basically the best data that you can find, which as you mentioned might be very, very different for certain regions, and you simplify it into what is honestly an oversimplified, but the best we can do sort of comparative analysis. And I think that could be it could be valuable, of course. Yeah, but the question is, what do you do for regions that don't report? And this is an open question, and so I'd be curious to hear anyone or your thoughts. Is what do you do for regions that basically don't don't report any data, or B, you just honestly can't trust anything that they report? So what do you do about that? I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, I see what you mean, Matt. I mean, this is an issue that I grew up around the fisheries in Newfoundland, and I mean, my uncle being a fisherman, the amount of time that I saw him throw stuff out, I mean, it was never reported, obviously, back in the day. It probably still isn't today on some of the smaller commercial vessels back home. So, yeah, it's a really interesting and challenging problem to tackle. And you're right. I think it's one of these things that how do you incorporate uncertainty in these models and these indices? It's quite challenging. So. Do we have any other questions out from the audience? Oh, David, look, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Quick one. You mentioned somewhere in the paper that it will. You think that it will be tricky to get beyond that 10% level of bycatch for technical reasons. I wonder whether you could elaborate on this, because at least in terms of seabirds. Seabird bycatch, there are fisheries which manage to go far beyond that.
Yeah, so that number, we were talking specifically about discard. So that 10.5% is a discard rate. And what we mean by discard is that just is talking about fish and invertebrates.
Yeah, okay, so that's overall, yep.
Yeah. So that doesn't include seabirds, and the reason for that is because seabirds are recorded in numbers of animals, and fish, both bycatch and target catch, is almost always reported, at least in U.S. fisheries, in terms of pounds of individuals. So you have this 1-for-1. You could basically create a very simple ratio, and that's what we did there. And so the national discard rate in America has been cut in about half over the last 20 years or so, based on the data that we have or that we had access to. So that's pretty exciting. And I think what you might be referring to, but correct me if I'm wrong, is a reduction in seabird bycatch from some earlier rate, maybe now reduced by like 95%. And that's just like a relative rate of reduction in terms of, you caught 10,000 seabirds and now you catch 50 seabirds or something like that a year in a fishery. And the Alaskan region is actually one of the great examples of this in terms of Alaskan longline fisheries, just by introducing some simple techniques like scaring streamer lines and throwing bait off at different times of day, or bait that would sink quickly, or things like this. Alaskan fisheries are as far as I'm aware, some of the best examples in terms of that relative just drop off of seabird bycatch by implementing some really simple mitigation techniques and technologies. But yeah, I guess I'm not a fisheries biologist, which is ironic, I know, because we just published a fisheries analysis, but there are certainly lots of fisheries biologists that would have a lot to say about our discard rate and if and how it can get lower and those sorts of things. I'm not an expert on that, so I don't necessarily know what there is to be done about that. I will say that our discard rate is slightly lower than the international discard rate, for which there are good numbers actually. That's about 11%. So it's similar to slightly lower. But there are still room for improvements. And that's one of the points that we were trying to make in this paper, that while overall the U.S. is doing well in both mitigating bycatch and also disseminating bycatch information so it can be analyzed, one thing that I found frustrating over the course of this work, and this is about turtles in particular, is there's a pretty simple technology called a turtle excluder device, or a TED, that allows turtles to escape from trawl nets, basically. But for whatever reason, and I do not understand why, it is not mandatory in U.S. fisheries. So one of the fisheries in the U.S. that catches the most turtles is trawls, shrimp trawls, in the southeast Atlantic fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of the southeastern states. But what's frustrating is that TEDs, these turtle excluder devices, are very effective. They're relatively cheap, and yet they're not mandatory. And I don't understand why that is. And so being able to have technologies that we know are effective and yet we're not utilizing them is frustrating. And I'm sure that there's other examples of that, but that's just what I know of.
That's quite cool. Maybe Dimas, I know you're quite you're working with the Albatross Task Force, and you've certainly dealt with some of these issues with implementation of mitigation techniques by the fishermen. So maybe you could say a couple of words about your experience with the ATF. Let's see. There you go. Go for it.
Hello, guys, again, and congratulations for this work. It's actually quite incredible to see bycatch data collected in within such extension and regularity and methodology. That's quite amazing. Here in Brazil, I'm working southern Brazil for many years with seabird bycatch, from quantifying to developing technical solutions with fishermen at sea, with strong support, and within the Albatross Task Force. We work here in an NGO called Projeto Albatross, that is the partner of Albatross Task Force in Brazil. So we have been working a lot, and Brazil is a quite difficult place to work on seabird bycatch because our fisheries for the last 10 years are unmonitored. So there is no onboard observer program. So there's no national monitoring or quantifying of fisheries, catch or target species and anything. So the only assessment of seabird bycatch being conducted in Brazil is this work done for us with the volunteer collaboration of fishermen. So we go on board with them and we collect a lot of self-reported information through specific logbooks we deliver and collect from fishermen. And we have been doing this for the last, consistently for more than 10 years, 15 years.
That's great.
A lot, we achieved a lot here so far. So from having reasonable estimates of seabird bycatch, and we can model this and compare observed with self-reported data, which provide quite interesting results. We developed technology to mitigate seabird bycatch in terms of bird scatter line designs that are currently recommended by ACAP and ICAT, adapted to small vessels to our reality. Those mitigation measures, bird scatter line, line weighting, night setting, are now in the regulations. They were sanctioned. So in Brazil, all pelagic long line set operations south of 20 degrees south must have the 3 mitigation measures combined. So the regulation is amazing, and we all know that these mitigation measures are highly effective. But without monitoring effort at sea or any surveillance tool, compliance levels are still very low, and the continued mortality of seabirds is still high. We just finished a modeling bycatch rates and total bycatch through the time. So we see the sanctioning regulations itself are not enough to reduce bird bycatch without mechanism to guarantee this measure will be used at sea. And this is actually our great challenging for mitigates bird bycatch in global pelagic longline fisheries, because we all know the technology, we all know what works. Technically, the problem was solved, but the great challenging is how to decrease the abyss between regulations and recommendations and practice at sea. And these will only came with surveillance technology, machine learning technology, cameras, activity monitoring of the vessels for guaranteed night setting and this kind of stuff. Because in the end of the day, we don't have capacity to have 100% coverage of onboard observers. And 10% coverage asked by ICAT is actually nothing in terms of reliability of data or monitoring of bycatch. So the next step, staff can talk something about that, because we are on the same line, on the same front of work, we work together. So that's the great challenge. And we are finishing analysis in Brazil to deliver this message that, look, here we have the opportunity to monitor compliance with onboard observer, and how things didn't change because you don't have mechanisms to enforce this at sea. So it's not actually the situation in Brazil. Like here we had the opportunity to describe this robustly, and this is actually what we expect in all global fisheries that doesn't have onboard coverage programs or have a very low coverage. So that's the big message. So in terms of what can we do in fisheries without any information is something very challenging. And this depends on the level of collaborative and honesty of fishermen, because a lot can be done with self-reported information, but this information must have the minimum of reliability, because if fishermen are just lying because they don't want self-report irregularities, for example. If we are monitoring something through self-reported information that results in law breaking or irregularities, fisheries are more likely to not report this properly. If we are looking at other stuff that not necessarily are related to law regulations, it's more likely that we will get more reliable information. Just a comment overall here. And well, I spoke too much already.
You're all right, Dimas.
Thanks, Brent.
Thanks for that, Dimas. Okay, if you'll indulge me, I think what we'll do is we'll let Steph Prince just say a few words, just because I think this is an important and interesting issue, and then I think we'll head towards closing it up and letting people get on with their days. All right. Very nice. There you go, Steph. You're unmuted.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Yeah, as Dimas was saying, so I work with Dimas for the BirdLife International Marine Programme, and my focus is more on the high seas tuna fisheries. So I've typically been focusing on some of the Asian flagged fleets, as well as working with countries like the US, New Zealand, Australia. And as Dimas was saying, like the key issue is lack of observer coverage. You know, we're typically looking at 5%, between 5 and 10%, and some countries are even lower than that. So it's really hard to get a good understanding of seabird bycatch, especially for the rarer species where you're catching birds so infrequently that even if you have 10% observer coverage, you're very unlikely to be able to get a good picture of what's actually happening. So it's something we'd like to see is increased observer coverage, but countries are very resistant to that due to costs. And then even though it's not our main focus, we also have to consider the human rights issues for observers, because, you know, there's frequent stories coming out around the issues that observers are facing on board high seas vessels. So the main focus that we're aiming for at the moment is to try to work with countries on increasing electronic monitoring on vessels, as Dimas was saying, so cameras, loggers, those kinds of things. And until we have that, I can't see any way of actually really improving uptake of mitigation measures, because you can do plenty of educational work, you can bring in regulations, but until you have enforcement and monitoring and surveillance, you're not really going to see any differences. But just a couple of words on analysis of data. So recently we were involved in an analysis of seabird bycatch for tuna fisheries, so south of 20, and that was done in collaboration with scientists from the countries that are involved in those fisheries. And that worked quite well because those countries, like most of them, aren't willing to share that data just out into the whole world. So this was quite a nice exercise because it brought together in a series of workshops. Those scientists, they brought their data to the workshop, and then that was analyzed within those workshops, and then the data itself was then taken away by each individual country. So that, I wasn't involved in the analysis myself, so please don't ask me too many details on the analytical techniques, but they did come up with a fairly robust analysis of how many birds are being killed in those fisheries. So I'd be happy to chat kind of out of this forum a bit more about that with anybody if anyone's interested. But it is a massive challenge, as we've heard, data gaps, issues with observer coverage, just it's not an easy thing to analyze. So this paper is really great. So thanks for sharing it.
Thanks a lot.
No worries.
All right, Matt, I think if you have just a couple of brief comments, and then David and I will close it up and let everyone get on.
Yeah, no, thanks for everyone's feedback. I really appreciate it. It's been great to hear that it's been valuable to share this data with the world. So that's been great. A couple quick comments is, my background primarily has been working with seabirds, and so I don't work too much with them anymore, but I would love to sort of think more about seabird conservation in relation to this or other topics. So if there's something that you see with our data, or you might want to apply something that we've done to your nation's data, or to please let me know, and it'd be fun to work together, especially during this time when we're all locked down, not able to do anything else. Could be fun. Anyway, the other thought that I had is I work with people who are very deep into this dynamic management strategies to basically improve target catch to bycatch ratios for highly migratory and highly mobile marine species. And so there might be certain situations that some of you are aware of in your own nations or regions where you have really good environmental oceanographic data and really good tracking data. Let's say there's a particularly rare seabird or turtle or whatever. And basically a group that I work with is developing and has developed, essentially think about it like weather forecasts, but fishing forecasts, where you every day would get a new forecast as a fisherman in areas where you should be fishing and areas where you shouldn't be fishing, if you want to maximize your likelihood of catching target species and minimize your likelihood of catching non-target species. And so it's a really cool way to actually apply analytical tools to potentially mitigate mitigate bycatch in all taxa, but it could be very relevant for seabirds, especially species that are rare and that we have good tracking data for. So if anyone has any thoughts for that, I'd be happy to connect them with the people who develop these technologies. Of course, as of now, these sort of using these forecasts are purely voluntary in the US and in other places where they've been implemented, like I was going to say Hawaii, but that's also the US, California and Hawaii. But maybe in the future, these would become, I don't say mandatory, but maybe more in vogue to use, because certainly in high value fisheries, and this is a thought that I had that, you know, as part of a later discussion, I'm sure, but if you're targeting a high value stock like tuna, wouldn't it be financially in your best interest to do everything you can to make sure that those hooks are saved for tuna and not eaten by turtles and birds and mammals and everything else? And I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it to a tremendous degree, but dynamic management is one way to do that. But there's also these simple techniques like bird scaring lines. And so especially for high value fisheries, like a lot of these pelagic long lines are, I feel as though most technologies and techniques to increase your catch would be something that fishermen would be interested in, but I'm sure it's way more complicated than that. But in any case, dynamic management, data limited fisheries, applying these sorts of techniques to your regions or anything else, let me know. I'd be happy to chat more. It'd be very fun, I think. And thanks, Grant and David, for having me.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for joining us, Matt. That was great, and congratulations again on a really cool paper. David, do you have anything else you would like to add, or?
No, thanks a lot. That was really, really interesting, and a fairly long session, but I think that was necessary on such an issue. I was while listening, I was thinking about your comment, you know, and the way, you know, you propose to balance the economic value of a fishery with conservation issues, and from my perspective, you cannot really put this into perspective. You know, it's not because a fishery has a very high value and brings in a lot of income and a lot of jobs that in a way you can justify a significant ecological impact. And maybe, you know, I'm too naive and optimistic, but I think that in a way conservation should be decoupled from these economic considerations, because if you do ecosystem-based management of fisheries, you know, what you want is to maintain biodiversity and not necessarily take into account an economic value.
Yeah, cool. That's right, and there's, like I said before, you know, there's a lot of interesting issues around uncertainty here that need to be looked at in the future. I think that you know, it'll add an important piece to the puzzle, so to speak. So again, thanks everyone for joining us today, and thanks to the authors for their great papers. We really look forward to. Oh, wait, Matt, you were giving me a finger. You were.
Demas has a point that he really needs to say.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see that. Demas, I'll unmute you if you have a quick point.
Yes, very quick. I was just curious and wondering about the numbers of seabird bycatch on those fisheries mentioned in the paper. That, well, the recent paper of Ed Melvin showed a reduction in seabird bycatch rates from 70 to 90%, from 1995 to 2005, right? But still is presented an estimate of roughly 24,000 birds bycaught in 6 years, from 2015. So this is quite a high number. So even with 70 and 90% in seabird bycatch rate reduction over the fleet, you will still have these roughly 4,000 birds catch per year.
So one thing is, I'm not sure what, I need to relook at what specific fishery that Melvin paper saw that reduction in. It could be different fisheries, but I think, I mean, as far as I know, yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about, you know, bycatch, I mean, because that's 20,000 birds over 6 years, which is to say it's a lot of birds, but, you know, so yeah, I mean, I would imagine that fisheries the size as these Alaskan fisheries are in areas that are dense with seabirds, yeah, probably catching tens of up to maybe hundreds of thousands of birds a year. I don't know for sure, but I think it was a lot worse in Alaska for sure. And even those numbers are dramatically improved from what they were, especially if you look at it on an annual basis.
Cool. All right. Well, if anyone has any more questions for Matt, you can find his email there online, or if you want me to put you in contact, just drop me a message, and I can.
Yeah, and I'll share some papers with Grant, and maybe he could put them up on the website or something.
Yep. Happy to do that. All right, everyone. Thanks again, and thanks to the authors. It was nice to see your faces and hear your voices, and we're looking forward to seeing you again next time. Take care, everyone, and have a good evening or a good day. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.